The rational attitude, in the absence of a very strong case for the existence of a Christian God, is to believe that there is no such thing. Just as the rational attitude towards any speculative theory, in the absence of a strong case in favour, is to presume that it is probably false. Speculative religious theories are a dime a dozen, and the vast majority of them have to be false. Why should we suppose that this one is any exception to the rule?
He does give one argument for atheism, though, which is that the absence of evidence for God should lead us to think that God does not exist. Well, now, I think this is fallacious. The absence of evidence is not necessarily evidence of absence. For example, we have no evidence of an early inflationary expansion of the universe. And yet, many cosmologists believe that such an era actually occurred. Or we have no evidence that there's gold on Pluto, for example. Does that mean, therefore, there is no gold on Pluto? Clearly not. So when does the absence of evidence count as evidence that something does not exist? Well, it would only be in the case that we have a situation in which if something did exist, then we should expect to see more evidence of its existence than that which we do see. For example, the absence of evidence for a planet between Venus and the Earth is good evidence that there is no such planet. Now, apply that to God. The absence of evidence for God's existence would count as evidence against God's existence only in the case that if God did exist, we should expect to see more evidence than we do see. And in practical terms, what that means is if God exists, should we expect to see more evidence of his being than the origin of the universe out of nothing, the exquisite fine-tuning of the universe for intelligent life, the apprehension of a realm of objective moral values, the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth from the dead, and the immediate experience of God? Well, I think the answer is obviously not. So to carry this point, Dr. Millican needs to prove that it is highly probable that if God exists, then we should have more evidence of his existence than that which we do have. And I think that's sheer speculation.
I agree, incidentally, that absence of evidence is not necessarily evidence of absence, but I disagree with his claim that if God existed, you'd expect a world just like this one, or at least it seemed to me that that was an implicit claim. If God existed, I would expect a world in which his existence was a great deal more plausible than the existence of anti-God. And I'm not going to argue that case in detail now. You've probably got enough of that in London from Stephen Law. Coincidentally, both he and I have written papers with that hypothesis, and quite independently.
I said that the absence of evidence for an object is evidence that it doesn't exist only in the case that it is highly probable that if the object did exist, we should expect to see more evidence of it than we do. And here Dr. Millican simply asserted, honestly, his personal opinion. He says, I think if God existed, then his existence should be more obvious. But that's not much of an argument. I don't see any grounds for thinking that's highly probable, especially if we're dealing with a God who knows how people would react under different circumstances. He may well know that giving any more evidence of his existence would not lead more people to love and come to know his salvation and find eternal life. God isn't interested in just convincing people that there's one more piece of furniture in the universe, some extra object to add to their ontology. He wants people to come into a saving relationship with him. And it may well be the case that God knew that if he were to provide any more evidence, it wouldn't do any more good in bringing people into such a relationship. If people won't look at the evidence that we have now, perhaps they wouldn't have come to know God and find salvation, even if the existence of God were as plain as the nose on your face. Indeed, they might have come to resent a God who made his existence so obvious for such effrontery.